So let me check our time. Okay, we're just at about 7 o'clock, so I'm just going to officially get started and welcome everybody to the Harris Center's BAT program with Haley Andreozzi and Sandy Houghton, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. I'm Susie Spickle, the Community Programs Director at the Harris Center and one of the naturalists, and I'll just have Brett introduce herself since she's here too, put her right on the spot.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brett Thielen. I'm the science director at the Harris Center, and Susie and I did bat counts together this summer at some barns near Harris Center protected land.
Oh my gosh, those are my favorite nights of the summer. I love the bat count program, and I know that you guys are going to talk about it. Speakers tonight, we have two incredible women who have been working really hard on bats. We have Haley Andreozzi from New Hampshire UNH's Cooperative Extension, and Sandy Houghton from New Hampshire Fish and Game's non-game department. And as Brett mentioned, they run the New Hampshire Bat Counts program, which has volunteers going out and counting bats in the summer at barns and other structures. And they really know so much about bats. They're going to share all of that with us this evening. So sit back and get in your bat cave, get comfortable, and get ready. And remember, if you have any questions, put them right in the chat and I'll try to ask them at the end. So Haley and Sandy, thank you so much tonight, and the floor is yours.
It takes it over that. It's great to spend this, evening of Bat Week with everyone. So just happy to see so many people enthusiastic about New Hampshire's bats, and there's one costume in the audience, so I'm happy to see that as well. Sandy, you want to get us started?
Yeah, this is great. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for having us and for joining us to talk about bats of New Hampshire. So I'm Sandy Houghton. I'm with the Non-Game and Endangered Wildlife Program at New Hampshire Fish and Game. So tonight we'll give a brief overview of bats of New Hampshire, and you can't really talk about bats in New Hampshire without touching on white nose syndrome. And then we'll get into a bunch of actions and how we can all help. So first, I want to give a tribute to bats. I think there's already been a few given by our lovely introduction, but they're really cool and fun to watch. They're fascinating. I think they're nocturnal, as we all know. They fly. They're our only mammal that can truly fly. Their wings are strong and flexible. They're able to really navigate through the forest at night. And so they can see, but they use echolocation to help them navigate in the dark and hone in on their insect prey. They're our largest predator of night flying insects. They're eating agricultural pests, forest pests, even mosquitoes. And they're really efficient at doing this. They're eating half their body weight to even more when they're pregnant or nursing or trying to increase their fat stores. So quite a bit. They can live to be really old for such a small mammal. We have through banding, which if you look closely at this photo, you can see a band on the forearm there. We've documented bats over 30 years old. They're really light and small, so they can be just a few coins. You almost don't feel them when you're holding them in your hand. And our smaller bats, their wingspan is just 8 to 10 inches, and some of our larger bats are just over a foot. So they're not all that large. Sometimes people think big brown bats are little brown bats because they are also quite small. I forgot to mention that the loss of bats, because they're such predators of night flying insects, it could in agricultural pests could lead to billions of dollars per year in agricultural losses, according to one study. So it's really helpful to take a look closely at a year in the life of the bat, and given that we're kind of in between, but we'll start with the fall swarming, as that's kind of close to where we are now. So this is a time period where bats who hibernate in New Hampshire are going close to the area where they're going to hibernate, and they are foraging and they are trying to increase their fat stores. So they really want to get ready to go into hibernation. They're eating as much as they can, and they're also mating. So it's bats who have spent the summer all throughout the region coming together near where they're going to spend their winter in a cave or mine and mating and foraging. Sometime in October or later, depending on both the species. So like our eastern small-footed bat is one of the latest ones to go into hibernation and the earliest to come out. And also depending on the weather in a given year. So they're eating insects. So if you think about once the insects are gone, hibernation is their strategy for survival. So in certain years, you might have a longer time frame where they're able to take advantage of insects on the landscape. But they're going into hibernation, they're lowering their heart rate, they're lowering their body temperature similar to the cave or mine, and really just living on their fat stores throughout the winter. Come spring, they're emerging, generally around mid-April, and they're staying in that area near their cave or mine and feeding and replenishing the fat stores that they lost throughout the winter. And this is the time period when pregnancy is initiated. They don't spend the winter pregnant. They save their energy. And then they're heading towards where they'll spend their summer. This may be in a forest or barn. And some of the females are coming together to form what's called a maternity colony, which you'll hear about a couple times more tonight. And they're taking advantage of the group for the heat and the safety to help their pups survive. The pups are born around mid-June, and for the first month, they're not able to fly. So that's a really critical time where they're waiting for their mom to return and they're nursing, and they're really dependent and unable to fly. Around July, mid-July, August, they're able to fly. They're learning to feed. And by the fall, they're full-sized, and you could not tell a juvenile from the year from an adult, and they're headed towards those caves or mines to again get ready for hibernation. So
Hey,
next slide.
Sandy, there's a couple of questions about mating in the autumn, but not getting pregnant until the spring. And so the question is, do they store the sperm? Is it delayed implantation? And could you talk a tiny bit about that?
Yeah, so it's delayed. It's stored and then delayed. Yeah. So a closer look at these habitats. So in the summer, we talked about the barns where you might have a maternity colony, also in a bat house or an attic. They may also be in the forest, so taking advantage of cavities and crevices in trees, as shown in the center lower picture, or underneath bark. So here's like a shagbark hickory. They may find that tight crevice where they're able to be safe and roost during the day, safe from predators. Also thinking of that like tight space and crevice where they're safe from predators. Our eastern small-footed bats will roost in crevices between rocks on talus slopes, or even on like the face of a dam where it's warm. But again, in that tight space where predators wouldn't be able to get them and they can rest safely. And then in the winter, we have 5 species that hibernate in caves or mines throughout the Northeast. And these caves and mines have a stable temperature, generally between 34 and 40 degrees, and really high humidity. So it may be over 80%, it may be as high as nearly 100. It can sometimes be hard to manage, but we have 5 species that hibernate in caves and mines in the Northeast. That may be in New Hampshire, but we do have records through banding of some of our bats going to Vermont and New York. And these are all shown here, but we'll talk about these bats again later. So I'm not going to read all the names. We can move on to the next slide. So we also have 3 bats that migrate as their strategy for surviving when the insects aren't available. So they're going south to where it's warm. They may go through periods of torpor, but they're generally staying active. And these are some of our larger bodied bats, the red bat, hoary bat, and silver-haired bat. Red bat might be more familiar. They tend to be the one that is underneath a street light in urban areas or house lights, foraging. and they tend to forage, all of these bats tend to forage in more open areas. So they're bigger bodied and less agile, so they're not necessarily going through the tight forested areas. So bringing this all together, we have 8 bat species here in New Hampshire. On the left-hand side, we have our 3 migratory bats in the green boxes, and these bats are declining as a result of habitat loss and threats they may face on their migration, such as wind turbines. And then on the right-hand side, outlined in red, we have our 5 bats who hibernate in New Hampshire. And you'll note that 4 of these 5 bats are listed as state endangered, and these bats have suffered great declines as a result of white nose syndrome. They also have, issues with habitat loss and other factors, but that's really a big driver of their population declines. So white nose syndrome was first documented in New Hampshire in 2009. At that time, it was new. Our scientists were scrambling to learn what was going on and why bats were dying during the winter. It caused mass mortalities at hibernacula. Cave hibernating bats in New Hampshire were decimated by white nose syndrome, and throughout the Northeast, it killed millions of our beneficial insect-eating bats. And what we've learned in the meantime is that it's caused by a fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is for short, they call it PD. And PD grows into their skin. So it grows into the wings, the ears, the nose, as you can see in the photo. And if you think about a researcher early on looking up at a bat in a cave, they would have seen the white nose. So that's where the name comes from. Not all of the bats will exhibit that symptom, but it's growing into their skin, and bats appear to die from a disruption in their metabolism. It's a fungus, and it's really easily transmitted through the spores. It can be carried on bats, on humans, on human gear, all sorts of stuff. So it's slowly made its way across the country, unfortunately causing large population declines throughout. Not all bats. So as we said, in 2009 is when white nose syndrome was first documented in New Hampshire. And you can see in this chart just dramatic declines following that as the invasion became epidemic, and throughout New Hampshire, our winter surveys just documented really dramatic declines, over 90% for some species. In 2018, our most recent winter surveys, we did not really document any signs of recovery, and basically it was a kind of a stable at a low level. We do have surveys planned for this winter. Cautiously optimistic there could be signs of recovery, but any recovery of our bat populations is going to be slow, as they only have 1 young per year. So it's just, given the dramatic state of these declines, it's really going to take some time for any recovery to occur. Next slide. So as we mentioned, not all bat species have been impacted the same, and 3 of our bats have been really impacted in our winter surveys. We've observed 99% declines for these 3 bat species: the little brown bat, the tricolored bat, and the northern long-eared bat. These 3 bats are also subject of a United States Fish and Wildlife Service species status assessment undergoing. And they're really kind of motivating us to work as all bats. We're working as a team, state, federal, biologists, conservation, universities, everyone, to try and gather as much information as well as to work on strategies for both treatment and conservation recovery. So throughout the country, environmental treatments are being experimented with. There's a few years ago, UV light was demonstrated to kill the fungus, and so now there will be an experiment ongoing testing the lights that they use in hospitals for UV treatment of a room to disinfect, and those will be put in mines when bats are not there to remove the environmental reservoir of the fungus. There's also a vaccine trial, and then there's also just a conservation recovery group working on other ways to minimize sources of mortality through best management practices and actions we can take, including improving habitat. increasing foraging habitat for the insects that these bats eat. So a few studies have found that fat bats are more likely to survive a winter with white nose syndrome. So offering the opportunity for them to have access to abundant healthy insect populations can potentially increase survival. So one of the actions is to not disturb. So while bats are in caves and mines hibernating, if someone were to enter, that can arouse them and cause them to burn their limited fat stores that are needed to get through the winter. But also in connection with that, the conservation of the area surrounding the cave and mine, so both protecting the cave and mine, but also that habitat that they're using in the fall for foraging, so protecting the forest and the wetlands and the streams to give them access to foraging habitat, can allow them to eat and be healthy when they go into hibernation and improve their chances of survival through the winter. And then there's a bat gate is one way to reduce, so bats can fly in and out of a cave or mine, but it reduces other disturbances. It's shown here. And so way before white nose syndrome, a bat gate was installed at one of our mines in 1992, and then the population of bats was, around 1,000. And after the installation, it started to climb closer to 2,000. So demonstrating the reduction of disturbance can benefit survival of these bats. This graph ends in 2009 with the onset of white nose syndrome. I think the current population at this mine is closer to 40 bats.
Sandy, while the slide is switching, there was a question about white nose syndrome and its origin. And somebody put in the chat that it came from Europe and then was transmitted into the caves here. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where did white nose come from? Where did the fungus come from?
It does appear that may be possible. That's the closest related strain of white nose syndrome, and it is present throughout Europe, so that is quite possible. And it could have been transmitted through cavers or other folks bringing who have entered caves there, bringing that back to caves here. So a lot of our national parks will have decontamination for anyone going into a cave or mine so that you're not spreading further. So I'm now going to turn it over to Haley to talk about some more actions.
Thanks, Sandy. So Sandy just provided some ways that you can help bats, bat-friendly gates, right? Protecting some of these mines and caves, but some of those are pretty inaccessible actions for a lot of us, right? Or maybe not directly related to our experience with bats. So luckily there are a lot of other ways that we can help bats in New Hampshire and beyond that are a little bit more accessible. And we hope that you'll get involved with one or some of them. The first that I'll point out is a program that we've mentioned a few times called New Hampshire Bat Counts. And this is a project that, again, Sandy and I coordinate on behalf of New Hampshire Fish and Game and UNH Cooperative Extension. And it's basically a program that we run every summer where we're looking for volunteers to count bats as they emerge from the maternity colonies that Sandy mentioned. I'll go over in a little bit more detail what those are and what they look like. But basically it's volunteers out at night, like Susie and Brett, out at night in the summer, counting bats as they emerge from these colonies and then return to these colonies. And so the data from these summer bat counts has been really critical for us to be able to see where bats exist currently in New Hampshire and in what numbers, and also help us understand what is special about the places where bats exist, and maybe even where they're thriving or where we're seeing numbers increase. Do those places, do those sites have some characteristics in common that can help us make some management and conservation decisions about bats in the future? And then generally, it just gives us a good idea of how bats are doing in New Hampshire, especially if we have sites where volunteers are counting year after year. We can almost use that as an indices of sort to say, this is a good year for bats, or this appears to be a bad year for bats in different locations around the state. So it's not perfect, right? It's not necessarily a comprehensive survey of every bat in the state of New Hampshire, but the more data that we have from volunteers all over the state, the better picture that we can paint about New Hampshire's bat population and the places that are important to them and that they're using on the landscape. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this program because we do hold trainings every spring with more instructions and information on how to do these counts and how to participate. But just to give you an overview of what's involved, we really ask that we want volunteers to count as many times and as often throughout the summer as they'd like. But with that said, we only expect volunteers and really ask or require that they do 1, but preferably 2 counts in the month of June. And then again, 1 or preferably 2 counts in the month of July. So that allows us to have a snapshot of bats at the number of bats at a particular site before pups begin flying and emerge, and then after pups begin flying and emerge. So it gives us kind of those 2 numbers to compare. And just to, again, Sandy mentioned maternity colonies, but just to kind of highlight, okay, where would you find these places to actually count? What do these places look like? What are these sites? When the weather gets warmer, these pregnant female bats, again, after that delayed implantation, they're waiting until spring to become pregnant. And then once they do, they're looking for these places to gather that are warm and safe to give birth and raise their young. So we call these roosts maternity colonies for that reason. And many groups of bats will return to the same site year after year. So if a site's used in it one year, it's likely that that site's going to be used in subsequent years. And here in New Hampshire, we're lucky that these maternity colonies occur in places that we can easily observe in a lot of situations, whether it's abandoned houses, barns, outbuildings, church steeples, and then for some people, even in occupied structures like attics, for instance, which isn't necessarily ideal for everyone involved, but does happen that bats might take up a maternity colony in an attic. And so all of these places can provide a summer home to female bats and their young. And when we talk about these maternity colonies that are specifically in structures and that we're having volunteers count, we're really talking about 2 bat species in particular. The first is little brown bats, which are just one of the bat species here in New Hampshire that are typically found in barns or houses. Typically, we see little brown bats selecting buildings that are close to open water so that they have the ability to forage on mosquitoes and other aquatic insects at night. And little brown bats in particular prefer to gather in really large colonies. And so before the onset of white nose syndrome in New Hampshire, you would see colonies of little brown bats in the hundreds or even thousands on a somewhat regular basis. Unfortunately, because then, as Sandy mentioned, little brown bats are one of our cave hibernating bats, and they're doing that hibernation also in large numbers and gathering in large numbers of individuals. They're also one of those species that's most susceptible to white nose syndrome. And so I've seen really significant declines. And so while once one of our most common, house bats really frequently seen in outbuildings in these maternity colonies, we don't see them so frequently anymore. And then this second bat species that we typically are looking for volunteers to count as they emerge from these maternity colonies are big brown bats, which is the second of our bat species we have here in New Hampshire that are typically found, again, in buildings, barns, outbuildings, attics. They're definitely our most common attic bat. And it's also the case that they sometimes, not just have their maternity colonies in buildings and attics, but can also be found hibernating in buildings in the winter. And that's because unlike little brown bats that are very, very tiny, big brown bats are also tiny, but they are slightly larger, and that slightly larger size allows them to tolerate slightly more variability in humidity and temperature conditions than little brown bats. So it is the case that on occasion, big brown bats can be found hibernating in attics here in New Hampshire. And so if this is something you're interested in, again, we hold trainings each spring, but you can also go to the New Hampshire Fish and Game webpage on Bats of New Hampshire. The URL is here at the bottom of the screen, and you can find a lot more information on this program by clicking that link right at the top of the page. And so that's going to bring you to a site where there's much more information. There's data sheets. We now have an online data submission option for volunteers to do their counts. So you can submit online to us via a form right after you've done your count. But again, a lot more information there. And I would say one thing in particular that you might want to take a look at is this really quick video that just kind of goes over the protocols and procedures of counting and shows you kind of what it looks like. So, what does it look like to fill out the data sheet and stand outside in the dark while bats fly out of a building and into a building. So again, if it's something you're interested in, we do have a newsletter that you can sign up for, and I'll make sure that Susie and Brett send that link out for the New Hampshire Bat Counts Project, and any trainings that we host will be announced there. And we also share information on the upcoming counting season and results after the season is over. So yeah, sign up for that if you're interested. But not everyone maybe has the ability or is interested in participating in that counting effort. And so it's also the case that we are looking for people to just report bat maternity colonies to us. So even if you're not able to count or get out multiple times in the summer to actually count these bats, we just want to hear about places where you know that there are 10 bats or more. And so if you do have 1 or 2 individual bats in your attic or in your barn, we think that's great too, but we don't necessarily want to hear reports about those. We're really interested in sites that are attracting bats in larger numbers, which currently we would consider 10 or more bats. Again, you can find information about where to report your bat colonies on the New Hampshire Fish and Game Bat website under the Report Bat Colonies link. And there, again, it's a really simple form to fill out about where this bat colony is located and other information about the site and you potentially as the landowner. We just can't know where all of these bats are all over the state of New Hampshire without input from folks like you. I mean, bats are very spread out and a lot of them occur on private land. And so, we need that input from folks all over the state to help us have a better picture of the status of bats here in New Hampshire. Where they're found, but also the types of structures they're using. And again, even if you don't have a bat colony and call your very own, we hope that you'll share information with your neighbors, your friends, your family, that we are looking for this information. And if they have a bat colony, let them know that they can report it to us. So that's how you can help bats, by volunteering or sharing data, useful data and information, but you can also help bats by letting them exist where they have for centuries. And again, in your barn or outbuilding in a lot of cases. Again, these habitats, these man-made habitats have become critically important, especially for species like little brown bat and big brown bats. And, we recognize and work with a lot and hear from a lot of landowners or homeowners who have concern about guano. They don't want bat poop on their stuff and they don't want to be, intermingling with the species quite that intimately. And so in those situations, we have some recommendations for how you can hang tarps or create false ceilings in a barn or other outbuildings so that you can easily remove the tarp or false ceiling to clean it if necessary. But it preserves your equipment or whatever you're storing in that space, protects it from the guano while at the same time allowing the bats to use the structure that they've become accustomed to and identified as really valuable habitat. But bats don't just stay in barns and outbuildings, right? So probably it's likely that many of us have had bats in our homes, and in my case, my office on campus is frequented by bats. I know, luckily, people know to knock on my door, for better or for worse. So many of you have probably had bats living in your home or attic as well. Again, whether it's 1 or 2 individual bats or more than that. And bats that are a problem can usually only be remedied by excluding bats from the house. And so when I say excluding bats, I'm talking about using typically a structure or device that allows bats to exit the structure, but does not allow them to then come back in. And so when we talk about excluding bats, it's usually, again, using a device that allows them to leave, but not then re-enter the structure. However, allowing bats to be successful raising their pups is critically important. So even in attics, if there's no immediate human health issue, we really encourage homeowners to just kind of wait it out, let the bats remain there until that pup rearing season is over, basically until the summer months are complete. Let the pups fly and then initiate that exclusion process where you're allowing bats to leave your structure and then not come back in. As Sandy mentioned, these species are only having 1 pup a year typically, and so it's critically important to replenish these populations that they're able to raise those pups successfully. So in attics or other places where you're looking to exclude these bats, if you exclude the adult bat before the pups fly, then you run the risk of having those pups left behind and starved. And so not only not being raised successfully, but then you have dead bats in your attic to deal with. So not ideal for anyone. I'll say beyond that, there's also a chance that, okay, so because of the baby issue, right, the pup issue, it's ideal to exclude bats in the spring, right, before mid-May, before these bats are even coming to identify and use your structure. If you haven't gotten to that, it's ideal to do it after August, right? Again, after these pups have already flown and the adults have flown off to begin swarming and looking for their fall swarming sites and their winter hibernation sites. But then taking it a step further, as I just mentioned, there is a chance that big brown bats are hibernating in some attics in the winter. Not all by any means, but definitely some attics. And so we also want to avoid exclusion during that time, since they could be trapped there the coming spring potentially. So really the best times to do bat exclusion work in your house is either in the month of April or the month of September. Those are like not really ideal windows, but if you are someone who really cares about bats and doesn't want to share your space with them, but also don't want to harm them, those are kind of your ideal windows for doing that type of work. And I'm sure many of you have seen or heard about bat houses. You see some for sale on the side of the road, or maybe your neighbor has one hanging up on their barn. But essentially, bat houses are artificial roosting sites for bats. And bat houses can help bats that you do choose to exclude from your attic or your barn if you put bat houses up before the exclusion. So they're really most successful when they're being offered as kind of an alternate habitat or alternate roosting site when you're going to be excluding bats from a place where they are currently exist. There are specific requirements for bat houses. I'm not going to go into all of them, but in general, you want a large size for your bat house. The larger the bat house, the more successful they tend to be. You also want them to be dark in color and facing either south or southeast so that it gets really hot. You basically want attracting sun and creating the same types of warm, humid environments that these female bats are looking for to raise their young in your attic or your barn, for instance. And then ideally they're 12 feet high off the ground and mounted on a building. You do see one mounted on a pole here in the middle. Those can be successful, but we tend to see more success with bat houses that are mounted on the side of buildings. And Bat Conservation International is an organization that's a really good place to go to for information about bat houses. You can see that they have designs and suggestions for different types of bat houses. On the left is a single chamber bat house, and on the right is a 4-chamber bat house. In the past, and I'll say Bat Conservation International has been doing research on what characteristics make bat houses successful for over a decade. In recent years, they're especially recommending those multi-chamber designs as ones that tend to be more successful. That's not to say that single chambered won't be successful, but those multi-chambered tend to be more successful. And with bat houses in general, it's not always, if you build it, they will come. Sometimes they do come. Again, usually they come, or it's more predictable that they would come if you're already excluding them from a place nearby. But it can take several years. And there's other factors and considerations that you need to take. How close is it to the nearest tree? That has some predation pressure associated with it. So again, there's a whole list of suggestions, and we'll make sure that Susie sends out some information on that following this talk. But yeah, and anyone's welcome to email us for suggestions on where to, kind of where to get those best practices and the best, most reliable information. And so bat habitat isn't just about your barn, and it's not just about bat houses. You can also help bats by maintaining or enhancing existing bat habitat on the landscape. And so one really significant way to do this is just to keep forests as forests. And that sounds really simple, but inherently, keeping forested areas on the landscape provides the trees that many bats require for roosting, and also provides some important travel corridors for bats, so places where they can fly and move about. Ideally, in an ideal world, we want to also maintain or establish what we would consider continuous riparian forests. So forested areas next to streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, areas where bats are, again, finding both the habitat features that they need, but also the food sources they need in forms of abundant insects next to those water features. And the bigger the habitat blocks, the better. So, we just know in general that larger habitat blocks support more wildlife species and can support more individuals. And so that's true for bats as well. So this might feel really big picture, right? It's not as in your control as bat houses or your barn. But if you're a landowner yourself of any size, or if you're on your town's conservation commission, for example, you do have the ability to have a direct impact on land management and conservation decisions that can add up to make a difference across the landscape. And if you're not, you can support local conservation projects or talk to your friends or your neighbors or your family about maintaining habitat on their land. And part of maintaining habitat involves protecting roost trees. So as Sandy mentioned earlier, this includes both occupied roost trees, so trees that we actually know are being utilized by bats in a given season or at a given point in time, but also potential roost trees. So, we can't always know what trees are being actively utilized by bats, but we can identify trees that have those ideal characteristics, those ideal qualities that bats are looking for. So as a reminder, in summer, some bats are using trees for roosting in any species and trees that are over 3 inches in diameter. And they'll use the cracks and crevices that you see here. They'll use the shaggy bark that you see on the right-hand side. And they're especially interested in snags, which are just dead standing trees, and cavity trees, so trees with holes in them. So those are not something that we inherently might be looking to protect on the landscape if we're just looking at it from kind of a visual appeal perspective, but they're really attractive places for bats. And then we also want to think about the timing of when we're cutting trees. And we want to do that to think about minimizing the impact, especially on young bats when, again, they're not capable of flight. So cutting trees in the winter is really best for bats, again, because they're not going to be using those trees for roosting. But ultimately, what you really want to avoid is cutting trees anytime in June and July at a bare minimum. And then I'm going to hand it back to Sandy to give us a little bit more information on what we can do to celebrate Bat Week.
I think as everyone's mentioned, there learn, support, and share. So there will be trainings in the spring on the bat count program. There's some really great resources online. EduBat and Save Lucy have a ton of fun things for kids and teachers, and adults can enjoy as well. UNH Cooperative Extensions keeps a list of trainings. Occasionally there's habitat management ones, such as shown here where forestry practices were discussed. We'll move on to the next slide, please. And so this week, and always the week before Halloween, is Bat Week. It's an opportunity to celebrate bats throughout the world, giving opportunities. So batweek.org has a lot of fun activities. They also have some online virtual events, declarations and things going on throughout the country, songs, and then ideas for things you can do in your community. A few years ago, we organized a bat festival, which was really well attended, and gave folks an opportunity to meet with biologists from the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, New Hampshire Fish and Game, as well as some of our naturalists, and just kind of take a moment to celebrate and also learn more about how we can all help with bat conservation. So next slide. I think these links have been shared in the chat, but I'm not totally sure. I haven't followed it completely, but there's 3 websites that may be of interest. The New Hampshire Fish and Game site that Haley mentioned has links to the colony reporting and how to do a colony count, as well as general bat in your house information. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hosts a whitenose-syndrome.org. They're really the leaders of that multi-group organization working on the conservation and recovery of bats. And then Bat Conservation International has a lot of resources, including bat houses, what to do if you find a bat in your house, and other actions you can take. So I think now we can move to questions. It looks like there's been some coming in.
Yeah, we've had a lot of questions. Thank you. What a great presentation. So many interesting things and some wonderful questions. I will just start with a question about a bat house. And this is from Brett, and I'm sure other people have wondered this too, but she has a small bat house with maybe room with 2 or 3 bats that have been roosting in it. And she's wondering if she can assume that those are probably male bats because it's not big enough to be considered a colony. So that's a question. And then are there correlated to that, are there bat houses that are big enough to be a maternal colony?
Sure. So I would say it could be male bats, and it could be bats that are using it as an alternative roost. So it could be females that are not breeding, or males, but depending on the temperature, bats will shift where they're spending the day. So they often know of more than one spot. There are bat houses that are big enough for a maternal colony. I think the 4-chamber one is one. Oftentimes they'll say to put up multiple. So if you're excluding bats from an attic, you may want to put up 2 or 3, just to both you can give that temperature range and also just provide more space. It looks like, I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
No, I was just going to add that there's some people call like the larger bat houses bat hotels if they're quite large. So just different terminology that can be used to describe a very large one.
I love it. This is kind of related to that question. It's from Cynthia, who used to, I don't know, Cynthia, if you're still doing a lot of bat counts, but you were the one who got me inspired about doing bat counts. But Cynthia, I think she had a really great idea. She's wondering if you think there could ever be any way that we could protect those structures, those historic structures, barns or outbuildings that are really important as bat maternal colonies. Have you heard anything like that? And is there anything that we regular folk can do to make something like that happen?
I know, I think it would certainly be of interest. I know at one point there was a barn that had it deeded in their language that it would continue to be bat habitat. I'm not sure how that works, if it holds up I haven't done the research for the legality of it, but certainly if a conservation organization was interested, and we're keeping track of our larger little brown bat colonies, and working with landowners on, like Haley had mentioned, allowing them to offer that barn as habitat to the bats by either having the tarps or internal bat houses, so they're happier with the bats. We try and do as much outreach and technical assistance in that regard.
That's great. So if somebody had a structure like that on their property and they wanted to contact one of you about how to keep the bats but not have the guano over everything, you would get back to them and be able to do like a site visit. Is that what I hear you guys saying?
We may or may not do a site visit, just because we do get quite a lot of contacts, so we have limited numbers, but we try to at least provide initial guidance, and then we will potentially do a site visit depending on
Great.
availability. And I guess I don't want to promise it, because
I hear you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I would say we have on occasion, Susie, and we do at times, but again, typically the requests we get for information are ones we can resolve or provide that information via email or over the phone, just through like a brief consultation. I'll also say there's a lot of room for creativity here, right? Like, we don't know every option for making a structure both, usable for the person's intended purpose and function, and then also allow it to be occupied by bats. We have suggestions based on what people have done in the past and that we've heard about, but there's a lot of room for creativity there. So we welcome suggestions from folks who have found a way to do it as well.
Great. So here's a question about white nose syndrome. I love this question. Somebody wanted to know, you mentioned, Sandy, that you were cautiously optimistic about the winter bat count with regards to the white nose syndrome. And she was wondering, what's making you cautiously optimistic? Is there something in the data? Is there some information that you could share with us? Or are you just a positive person?
So there's been spotted, like some of our colony counts have slowly climbed in the summer. Other states have seen slight increases in some of their sites, so not all sites. And again, if you think about it, it's been here for quite some time. So bats that are still here are surviving winters with white nose syndrome. So we hope they continue surviving, and we hope to start seeing more of them spending the winter where we see them in our mines. So I guess, yeah, there are little signs of potential positivity. We still see sites that were historically occupied that are not. So it's definitely not a totally positive picture at this point, but there's reason to have slight optimism, cautious.
Okay, and Emily just asked this question. I was wondering it too, so I was also going to add it. But how do you do a winter bat count without disturbing the bats? And that's probably not a volunteer thing. That's probably for trained people. So can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that?
So we only do it once every 3 years or more. I think the Fish and Wildlife Service guidance is not to enter more than once per year. So it's a limited disturbance. We also limit the time that we spend. So we're not, it's just a quick in and out so that it's least likely to disturb, and we limit the number of folks going. So it could cause some potential disturbance, but it's the minimum that would still give us that data.
Great. And there was a series of questions with regards to where the wintering grounds are for these bats, because I think people really don't think of New Hampshire as having caves the way other places like Vermont or New York State does. So, and I know you don't want to give any locations out, but can you talk a little bit about, are they empty mines, or what, how big does a cave have to be functional for a bat?
They are mines, so we don't have any known caves. We have some known areas of like talus slope that kind of forms a cave, but that we're not able to get into and survey, but where we know bats are spending the winter based on basically it was discovered during white nose syndrome when they emerged. But it's the mines and then some other structures, but size, if you think about it, it has to be big enough to have that stable temperature, so in the ground far enough that it's able to maintain, it's not going to fluctuate. When it goes down to 10 degrees, it's still going to be above freezing, in that 34 to 40 degree range. So they're I'm not sure exactly what the cutoff would be for that size, but not pretty shallow. Like you'd have to walk in at least 20 steps probably, I guess. It would be a guesstimate, but yeah.
So this is a related question about the big brown bats that might hibernate in people's attics. Are they hibernating in big numbers, or is that a smaller number? It sounds like when they're hibernating in the mines or the caves, then they're in quite a sizable number, but when they're in an attic, is it less?
It generally, what's been documented is fewer. It's generally just one individual to a few individuals is what's been reported that I've seen.
And then just back to the winter location of those hibernaculums in New Hampshire. Are they in a general specific region, and are those areas protected?
It's almost statewide. There's a few spots so they're scattered almost statewide, and I think maybe half of them are unprotected, either through fee or conservation easement protection. And almost all of our larger bat population winter sites are protected, but there are a few that aren't.
Great. Okay, and here's a series of questions are all kind of related to identifying bats. So when you're doing the New Hampshire bat count, are there any tips to identifying the difference between a little brown bat and a big brown bat? Or just if you're out walking and you see a bat flying, are there any specifics that people should look for in terms of identifying a bat?
Yeah, I would say that's going to be really difficult to do, just because, again, bats, as Sandy mentioned, while some are bigger than the other, they're all relatively tiny in size, and they're flying typically at such a height and a distance, and doing so at night, that it's really difficult to make that determination. The way that we can best make identifications for what species are using a maternity colony is actually looking at their guano, looking at their scat, and taking measurements of that scat to distinguish between little brown bats and big brown bats. Big brown bats have scat that's a little bit larger than a grain of rice, and little brown bats have scat that's a little bit smaller than a grain of rice. So there are times where we'll see both species using a maternity colony or using a bat house, for instance, but that's less and less common as we've seen the decline in little brown bats in the state. So yeah, typically bat poop is the giveaway.
People who know me know that's right up my alley.
Yeah.
I'm getting some chats personally to me about like, oh, right up your alley. Somebody raised this in the questions, and this is something that I know all of us kind of think about when we're looking at bats, or in a bat gets in our house, and that's bats and rabies. And I think if you could talk or address that a little bit, that seems to be one of the things that make people really nervous about living with bats.
Yeah, I would say that bats have a bad reputation, but not for very good reason. So I'll just say all mammal species, including humans, can be infected and carry the rabies virus. And so there are some bats that are infected with rabies, but the large majority of individual bats on the landscape are not. The issue with bats becomes that, we sometimes live in close proximity with them, right? So if someone wakes up and finds a bat that somehow made it into their bedroom, for instance, they're not sure what amount of contact they've had with a bat, whereas that's not necessarily usually the case with a fox or a coyote or a raccoon, for instance. You would know if you had a up close interaction with one of those species. So again, the kind of folklore around bats and rabies is kind of blown out of proportion, but there is reason to be concerned. If you were to come in contact with a bat that was behaving oddly and for some reason you could easily approach that bat. You don't want to touch a bat with your bare hands. And if you do find a bat that is in your living space, or potentially has been in a room with yourself or a young child while you're sleeping, we recommend that people call the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services to deal with that issue. But again, most bats out there are not really a concern.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have one last question. This is from John, and I know there's tons of really great questions that we didn't get to. And I guess what I would just say is keep your eyes open. And when you can get a chance to participate in the New Hampshire Bat Counts program, you'll get more information about bats, and it's a great way to learn more about bats. So keep your eyes open for any trainings that might be in your area. And the Harris Center is hoping to have one this spring as well. But the last question, it's a big question. It's from John. And that is about climate change and bats. And I wonder if you're noticing any kind of pluses or minuses with regards to bats. Or it's a big question and probably hard to answer, but what are you finding, Sandy and Haley?
So I'm not sure that anything's been documented at this point. There is concern if the temperature changes in any of the hibernacula, it gets out of that optimal zone, but to date, we haven't really documented that. So I think it's more concern like it could alter their habitat as our forests are changed and impacted through climate change. The availability of water, I think it's kind of similar with all species, and then disease can spread more easily, but Haley might be able to better speak to climate change.
No, I would say that again, for a lot of our wildlife species, there's not a lot of knowns, but we can make some guesses at potential impacts in the future. I think in addition to what Sandy mentioned, I think a lot about insects for bats, right? It's their main prey source. And, there are concerns about how insect populations are going to be impacted by changes in phenology or seasonal timings as climate change continues to make shifts and kind of when things bloom and when things appear in different weather patterns. So I think about kind of impact to insect populations being maybe one of the main negative impacts on bats in the future. But
wow, well, not all of a happy note to end on, but I do want to thank both of you for sharing today all this great information about bats and bats in New Hampshire and things that people can do as individuals and communities. That's really empowering, and hope everybody takes it to their heart and thinks about something they can do to make it better for bats in our world. And Haley and Sandy, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight to learn about bats. And hopefully we'll see you at some other programs or even out counting bats at barns and other structures. So thank you so much. And there's lots of thanking going on in the chat. Haley and Sandy, lots of love. So great job.
Thank
night,
you. Thank you for
everybody.
having us. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Good night, everybody.